Hello and welcome to European SharePoint Training Week, a week of live webinars, ebooks and blogs from the top SharePoint experts in the industry. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Alan Richards, who will be talking to you about installing SharePoint 2013 step by step. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC14. Alan is one of an impressive list of speakers for the European SharePoint Conference, which will take place in Barcelona, May 5 to 8, 2014. Go to www.sharepointeurope.com for more information on the 100 plus sessions that will take place. All of the speakers from European SharePoint Training Week will be there, along with the likes of Dan Holm, Jeremy Take, Christian Buckley and Rafael Lukovicskia. After the webinar we will have questions. Type any questions you have for Alan in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available to download. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Alan Richards. Hello, Alan.
Hello.
Okay, Alan.
Okay, so welcome to the webinar. What I'm going to talk to you about today is basically the steps for installing SharePoint 2013, the Office Web App Server and also the Workflow Manager. Most of the material is available in the eBook as well, that is available on European SharePoint community. So the agenda for today is roughly, firstly I'll do a little introduction to myself so you know who I am and my background. We'll look at things like security accounts, the actual installation of SharePoint, and then the Office Web Apps Workflow Manager. And then as I said at the beginning, just write some questions down if you have any, and we'll look at answering some of them at the end of the actual presentation. So, this is all my details. I am SharePoint MVP, which basically means it's an award given by Microsoft to people in the profession who gives a certain amount of information back to the community, so help the community out with things like blogs and speaking sessions and that sort of thing. I'm a senior consultant at a company called Foundation SP, which is a SharePoint consultancy firm. I've been a SharePoint MVP for 3 years now, 18 years in actual IT itself, and worked with SharePoint since it was the infamous Team Services, so I have been working with SharePoint quite a while. My blog is at the bottom of the page on the left hand side as you look, and that's my Twitter, LinkedIn and email address. And as MVP, like I said, we do work for the community, so if you do have any questions or need any help at any time, just use any one of those links to get hold of me. So, the first thing I'm going to look at is security accounts. Now, the one thing I would say for the webinar, I did try to look at doing some nice demos with my virtual machines that I've got on my system at home, but didn't quite work out. It's a bit slow across the link, so we're going for mainly presentations and screenshots of everything. So firstly, security accounts. As with anything in a network domain environment, you should always try and do everything with the least privilege. So basically, nothing should run in SharePoint with a administrator, local or domain administrator account. Everything should be done with the least privilege as possible. The only exception to that is actually when you set up SharePoint in the first instance. You should really set up in your Active Directory 3 accounts: a setup user, a farm service account user and an application pool account. And the only setup user is the only one that has to be added as a domain user but also a local administrator onto the SharePoint server that you're installing to. It also needs to be a database security admin and database creator, because as you can imagine, when you set up SharePoint using that account, it's used to create the configuration database that SharePoint relies on. The form service account, which in some places you'll find referred to as the database access account, that only needs to be a member of the domain users, and basically that's it. Nothing else. Even though it will need access to the database, that is actually set up by the setup system when you run the installation. The application pool account is basically used for all the app pools that run SharePoint. Again, only needs to be a domain user on Active Directory, and all the other settings are set using the installation of SharePoint. So in Active Directory, basically before you set up SharePoint, you should set up these 3 accounts. Now, you can call them whatever you like, but for ease, we normally use, whenever I do an installation, the SP and setup, Form AD and App Pool. It just gives a bit of consistency across the board, and it's fairly obvious when somebody goes into Active Directory after you, or in a few years' time after it's all been running, and it looks what these 3 accounts, and if they're prefixed with SP, then most people will know that it's SharePoint. If you want any more information about security accounts and how they're set up and what they actually do, if you go to that TechNet link on the bottom right hand side, then basically that will give you the full list of everything. It's a lovely, lovely long document to read, which I'm sure you'll spend hours of fun with. Okay, so let's move on to the actual installation of SharePoint. So, if any of you have read the ebook, you've probably seen this graphic. It's a standard 2-tier SharePoint installation, really, with a web front end, a server doing central admin, and then an apps server. And then at the back end of all of that, SQL, in this case SQL 2012. So everything we're going to talk about is based around this sort of form, but can be expanded and grown out to a form that's got multiple web front ends. The app server is basically going to be used for installing the web apps and also the workflow manager. Excuse me. Okay, so the first thing to remember when you're doing this, you set up your security accounts. Don't by accident go in and actually log on to your first SharePoint server as a domain admin. Log on to it as the SharePoint setup account and basically run the prerequisites installer. The one thing I would say about the prerequisites installer is that up until recently there was a little bit of a bug where for some reason it didn't install the .NET framework. I believe this is now fixed, but if not, then literally if you install the .NET framework and the web server role manually before you run the prerequisite installer, then everything will basically work fine. One thing I would say is if you have a SharePoint installation or you're doing a SharePoint installation for a client or your own company that has a heightened security level, in some cases those servers don't have access to the internet, and the prerequisite installer obviously downloads all the files to install the .NET and all the other bits and bobs. They actually download that from the internet. If you don't have access to the internet, of course that won't work. So without the prerequisite installer, you can't install SharePoint. What this screen shows is 2 scripts, basically from the website, written by the guy called Craig Lucia. And what these scripts do, they actually download all the SharePoint prerequisites for you and also install the prerequisites. So what you can do is actually download using the script onto a machine that does have internet access or the prerequisites, put them in a folder, take that folder and the installation script, move them to your SharePoint server and actually run that script to install all of the SharePoint prerequisites without actually having access to the internet. It's just a workaround for anybody that needs to install SharePoint on a heightened security server that doesn't have actually access to the internet. Last couple of screens from the installation. Product key. When you put your product key, that is what is actually going to tell you what version you have. So whether you want standard or enterprise. So it will install the features that are relevant to those. Two options for installation: complete and standalone. The complete basically is for production environments, so it'll install everything onto the farm, but you can actually connect to an external SQL server, which is recommended for production farms. Standalone you can do, which will basically install an express edition of SQL onto the same server, and it will install absolutely everything, the web front end and the central admin, onto one single server. That's not recommended for production. It just won't scale enough. So really you should only ever use that for testing or development purposes. So for instance, if you're a developer and you've got a laptop that you do all your developing on, you use this standalone to install a version of SharePoint onto your actual laptop to do all your development work. These screens basically are from when you start to expand your SharePoint installation into more than one server. So part of the setup when you install SharePoint for the first time is that you have to create a passphrase, and that passphrase is used for actually installing SharePoint onto any other server and connecting it to the configuration database. It's a bit like a lock and key, in that without the key you can't open the lock to add any more SharePoint servers to the farm. So you'll need that passphrase. You should keep it somewhere secure. However, if on the odd chance that you forget it, lose it, or you're not the person that created it in the first place, there is a PowerShell script that you can actually reset it. So basically you use the PowerShell script at the bottom, that will reset the passphrase for you, and you can actually then go ahead and start installing extra servers into your SharePoint farm. So once you've done the installation and everything's up and running, central admin comes up quite nicely and everything's working, then we start to move on to actually creating a SharePoint site. Within that basically is two elements. Is the web application side of it, which is like the website, and then the site collection, which sits on top of the web application to actually service users with the sites and pages and document libraries, etc. The first thing you should do before creating any web application within SharePoint is actually create a managed account. Now what a managed account does, it allows SharePoint 2013 to actually communicate with Active Directory and synchronize password changes if necessary. So in there you should put the username and password in the format of domain /user, and then basically that will allow for password synchronization. It will let you know when the password is about to change or when it can run out, so that you don't end up with a problem with the web application not running properly under that service account. From here you basically go into the SharePoint Central Administration, go to the Application Management section and manage web applications. And what that will do, that will allow you to see what web applications are already running, and you can click on the new icon to create a new one. When you open up to do a new web application, you'll get a nice long list of settings, so that these basically are the name for the website. So you want to put that in as something that's recognizable, whether it's management gateway, learning gateway, or anything like that. So, you know, public site, something like that. The port for the website, the default is 80, because obviously it's a website. So you can change that if you need to. So for instance, if you're going to run multiple web applications, you may have to use multiple ports outside of the 80 unless you use host headers. The path is fairly straightforward, unless that's a default path, unless you decide to move that somewhere else. The anonymous access is basically whether you want that site to have anonymous access allowed for it, yes or no. For most applications, unless it's going to be a public site on SharePoint, you click that as no. The SSL, use the secure sockets layer, is basically whether you want the site to have SSL or not. So literally, if you don't, you leave it as no. Otherwise, click yes, and you'll have to provide certificates for the actual website at the same time. If you want to allow authentication, then basically you can choose NTLM or Kerberos. Kerberos is the preferred method for SharePoint 2013 in a production environment. However, Kerberos will require some additional setting up actually on the Active Directory itself. You need to create a service principal for Kerberos to work properly. There are some information on that on TechNet. Microsoft TechNet will provide that sort of information for you. Other pieces that you need to do are basically select the security account. So for that, one of the things you'll have done is in the managed accounts is actually create your user for the application pool account. So you use that. You also need to access the database server and the database name, and then authentication for actually how people log on. Default being Windows for the database server. Once you've done the application, then basically you should get an email, a message saying that the application has been created, and a link there for creating the site collection. The site collection is a few less options. Literally the title, give it a description, and you can also choose at this point where the website fits. So that site collection, does it fit at the top level of the site, or does it sit under another site's one? So in that case, the westhatch.local / could be the root, or it could be sites and the site collection underneath that. In 2013, you also get to choose what experience version you require, so whether it's 2013 or 2010. If you want to, you can use 2010 so that your users have the same experience if you already have 2010 servers in place. And then the templates, the standard templates, team site, blog site, community, or if you're going a bit further, so there's enterprise, there are things like my site hosts and publishing sites for websites and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's some screenshots and some details of installing SharePoint 2013. It's fairly straightforward. As long as you make sure you've got the settings right and your service accounts all set up correctly so that it works perfectly. Okay, so installing Office Web Apps. Office Web Apps was introduced in 2010 as something that you could install onto the SharePoint server. And what Office Web Apps gives you, if you've never seen it before, is basically the ability to open and edit Office documents from within SharePoint. In 2010, as I said, it was installed onto the SharePoint server, so all the load was also on the SharePoint front ends. So if your front ends were a bit low on memory or processing speed, that obviously installing web apps gave it a little bit more load that could possibly tip it over the edge. In 2013, Office Web Apps is a separate entity and requires a little bit more configuration than the old version. So basically what you need to do is you need to have a separate server to run Office Web Apps from, so it actually takes the load away from SharePoint. And one of the prerequisites is to add all of these features. And the easiest way of doing that with Web Apps is actually to use PowerShell. So run this quite simple PowerShell script, and believe me, despite the fact it looks a complete mess, it is a fairly simple PowerShell script, which I'm sure when the PowerPoints are available you can just copy and paste off. The details for downloading Office Web Apps is at the bottom of the page as well. So you download that file to install Office Web Apps. And literally it's a fairly straightforward installation. you run the file. When you've got it, install it, and Office Web Apps is installed. You will basically require certificates for production environments of Office Web Apps, so that SharePoint can communicate securely with the Office Web Apps server. Those security certificates should come from a trusted source. Now, if you're only using Office Web Apps on an internal domain, then that trusted source may be your own internal certificate authority. So you could install those onto Office Web Apps. The requirement for external sites is obviously they have to have certificates installed, and if they're an external site, then obviously those certificates need to be trusted by external users who are accessing them, which basically means they need to come from a trusted external certificate authority. The configuration again is down to PowerShell. So once you've installed the Office Web Apps itself, you have to run this PowerShell script. And what this PowerShell script basically does is, if I take it through step by step, is the new Office Web Apps form is the actual commandlet. The internal URL is the actual internal URL that your internal users will access the Office Web Apps server, and it should be a fully qualified domain name. The external URL is for anybody accessing the site externally, so a publicly routable domain name in this case. And the certificate name is basically the friendly name of the certificate that you create for that actual website for Office Web Apps. A simple way to create the certificate is literally to go through IIS on the server itself and request a certificate. If it's an internal one, then you can request it directly from the internal domain certificate authority. If it's an external one, then obviously you would need to create the text file to submit to get a certificate for your server from somebody like VeriSign or Thwart or whatever. The editing enabled at the end is basically, without that, Office Web Apps is installed and configured in read-only mode, so it will only open up Office documents and won't allow any editing. So you need that command at the end. However, you need to make sure you are licensed to enable for editing. It is an extra additional license from Microsoft to allow for Office Web Apps and editing. So once you've installed it, all of you obviously need to verify that it's working. Literally, the easiest way to verify that your Office Web Apps is working properly is to browse to a web page which basically is HTTPS, whatever your server is hosting Discovery. And what you will get back, or what you should get back if it's working properly, is a screen of a load of XML, which basically returns back, and it will give you names like .doc and the references to different types of file types. Well, if you've got that, then the other thing to look at is claims authentication. Basically, for SharePoint 2013 to access Office Web Apps, the web application has to use claims authentication. Now, as a standard, that is turned on for anything created, any site or SharePoint that's created using the 2013 web application. If for some reason you've turned it off, or you don't have claims-based authentication on a particular web application, then again, a PowerShell script will convert that web application into claims authentication so that you can actually use it with Office Web Apps. Okay, so once you've actually installed and got the Web App Server up and running, you've tested it to make sure it's actually returning that XML that shows that it's functioning, and you've also done the certificates and etc. The next thing to look at is actually licensing your users. As a default, users don't have access to editing documents, and therefore they're only be able to view, even though you've enabled it for editing on the Office Web Apps server. So what you have to do is basically run a bit of a PowerShell again to enable users to edit Office web apps using different security groups within Active Directory. So you can use that basically to allow editing for everybody, or you can just allow editing for particular security groups. Again, there's another piece of PowerShell. You may be spotting a trend in that once you've actually created all that, you need to bind the SharePoint 2013 services to the Office web app server. It's a probably a shorter piece of PowerShell, but basically use that PowerShell, and the server name is should be the fully qualified domain name of the Office web app server, because it uses HTTPS. So you have to make sure that you put in a fully qualified domain name to actually bind Office web apps to SharePoint 2013. Once you've done all that, then basically you can go in and test it by adding a document and make sure it opens up with Office web apps, and if you've enabled editing, then make sure you can actually enable it, and make sure you can go in and actually edit documents with the Office web apps on SharePoint 2013. Now, one of the reasons it's moved over to a different server, as well as being able to take some of the load off SharePoint 2013, but also the Office web app server, while not part of this particular presentation, you should know that one of the main reasons for moving it over is that you can now start using it with other instances. So you can start using it with things like Exchange 2013 and Link 2013. So that that's one of the reasons it was moved, so that it can be used by other services within the Microsoft stack. Okay, Workflow Manager. As you probably know, Workflow Manager is another separate service that Microsoft have brought in for SharePoint 2013. So if you install SharePoint 2013 on its own, then you will get 2010 versions of workflows. So you'll be able to do all the workflows that you could do using SharePoint 2010. However, if you want some of the increased functionality that you get with 2013 workflows, such as more expressive workflows, the ability to loop back and add sections into workflows that the workflow can loop back to, then you need to install the Workflow Manager. Now, the Workflow Manager can be standalone, or it can actually co-locate with an installation of SharePoint 2013. Depending on your requirements for workflows, it is preferential to use it as a standalone server, so that you're not putting any load onto the actual SharePoint servers themselves. If you're a heavy workflow user, then it really will be recommended to have it as a standalone server. You could quite easily run it on the same workflow on the web front ends, but obviously that wouldn't be advisable. The installation of the Workflow Manager uses the Microsoft Web Platform Installer, which basically you go to that link there and you download the Web Platform Installer, and then it will start the installation of the Workflow Manager, and that will install everything that's needed, all the prerequisites and everything that's required for Workflow Manager. Once that installation is complete, then we actually move on to the setup. So all we've got here is just a summary page of the setup rather than each individual page. But basically, with Workflow Manager, you can install using a standard default settings, which does everything for you basically, or you can use custom settings, which is much more granular in the way you can actually set it up. So you can configure things like the connection to the SQL, service account. Again, you should have a service account that runs on least privilege, that runs the actual workflow service. You can use HTTP or HTTPS. However, the default is HTTPS, so you'll actually specifically need to tell it HTTP. it uses particular port numbers. So for HTTP, it uses port number 12291, and for HTTPS, it uses port 12290. If you don't know those, you need to write them down somewhere. Not exactly easily remembered. So as I say, HTTP is not enabled by default as it's not a secure method. So HTTPS certificates you will need for communication between the workflow manager and the SharePoint 2013 server. These again can be created using IIS. As a default, the workflow manager will create self-signing certificates. However, they won't work very well in a domain environment, and so you should really create certificates from a trusted certificate authority. Once it's SharePoint once the workflow manager is installed, you then need to actually connect each SharePoint web front end up to the actual workflow manager. Now the first thing that you need to do is actually go back and download the web platform installer again, and actually just this time install the workflow manager client. So once you've installed the client, you then need to register the workflow server with the actual SharePoint server itself. So in this case, what you basically do is you run another PowerShell script, which basically does the registration. You connect it to a particular SP site or site collection, and the workflow host URI is basically the fully qualified domain name and port of the workflow manager. In this case, the HTTP and the port number 12290 at the end. So once you've done that, you need to obviously check that it's working. So it's an extremely simple and straightforward way of making sure it works, and that is to go to the Microsoft website, download SharePoint Designer 2013, which is a freebie. Download that, install it, open it up, and from the ribbon bar at the top, start a list workflow or something, and connect it to any list you like. And what you should have is, when you try to create that workflow, you should have a platform type at the bottom. Now if that platform type doesn't appear, then your workflow manager is not working properly, it's not been connected to SharePoint form properly. If it does appear, then basically you have access to the SharePoint 2013 workflows, and you can carry on and do some very nice expressive looping ground workflows. Makes it much easier than it was in 2010. If any of you have ever done a SharePoint workflow for 2010, then you'll know that they're very linear, and that even though you may need to do, say, an email task, and that email task appears 4 or 5 times in a linear 2010 workflow, in 2013 you can have the email task as a step, but then use looping to actually say, well, if a particular condition is reached, loop back to step 10 or loop back to step 1 or whatever, and that step could be the email one. So it makes it much easier to actually create workflows in 2013. So that's basically the presentation over. I've done, gone through some of the stuff for installing SharePoint 2013, the web apps, and the workflow server. So what I'd like to do now is hand it over back to Declan to take some of your questions, and I will try and answer as many as possible.
Thank you very much, Alan, for a great presentation. We've had some questions flowing in there, so I'll start off with, will there be any disadvantage if I use SQL Server 2008 with SharePoint 2013?
No, the recommended one is normally R2 at the moment, but no, there's no distinct drawback.
Okay. Can I install SharePoint 2013 for test demo purposes on a domain controller?
No would be the answer. Not something I would do, no.
Another question here.
Yeah.
Do you recommend Auto SP installer found in Codeplex for deploying enterprise SharePoint solution?
I have used it in a few occasions, but it's not a recommended, it's not a Microsoft recommended way of installing SharePoint now.
Okay, another question here. Can we install SharePoint 2013 and Workflow Manager on the same VM?
Can you say that one again?
Can we install SharePoint 2013 and Workflow Manager on the same VM?
Yes, yeah, because if you've got SharePoint 2013 in a VM, then basically it's SharePoint doesn't care whether it's a VM or not, neither does Workflow Server, Workflow Manager. So the fact that they can co-locate, then yes, you can have both of them in the same VM. Obviously, I would say that depends on the load, whether it's just a testing or production environment, and then you've got to work out whether it, what workflows and what loads. If it's just a testing environment, then it will be fine.
Okay. We're getting a lot of people asking about the slides, and they'll be available in a week or so. We'll make them available with the video. And I think that's all the questions I have at the moment. Just one more question before we go. How can I make a site externally accessible from internet? Also, I want to publish my internal SharePoint contents to public site. Any link?
If you want to make your standard SharePoint site externally or publicly available, the steps really are: one, do you or don't you need anonymous access? So if it's going to be an externally available public website, then you also need to allow anonymous access, and then you need to provide a publicly routable domain name to that site. So the ways of doing that are literally through something like Microsoft UAG, or TMG, Threat Management Gateway, some sort of way of pointing that public website to the SharePoint site. What was the other half of the question? Sorry.
Also, I want to publish my internal SharePoint contents to a public site. Any link?
It depends. Sorry, but it depends what it means by publishing the internal content to the public website. If it just means publishing that content, then it's the same again. You need to have a public website to be able to view it. If the person means taking content from an internal site to a public site, then you are talking really about things like workflows to move site around, or content organizers, to actually create a content organizer that takes documents that are put in a particular document library and move them over to another site that's publicly available.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Alan. That's all the time we have for our questions today. So before you go, I just want to ask everyone a question. Are you coming to Barcelona? For those of you that don't know, the European SharePoint Conference will take place from the 5th to 8th of May 2014 in beautiful Barcelona. For more information about what you can expect at Europe's largest SharePoint conference, check out our website www.sharepointeurope.com. Currently, we have a range of competitive pricing options with our great early booking offer. Get a 3-day delegate pass from only $9.95. We also have some fantastic group booking offers available. The bigger your group, the bigger the discount. Check out our pricing page for more information. That's all for today's webinar, and hopefully you can join us again for more great webinars this week. Goodbye.